Orthostatic Tachycardia Syndrome as a Sequela to COVID-19. And our speaker today is Ross Rosen. And this is really an important topic because already people have been experiencing chronic diseases and autoimmune-like diseases. And now with COVID infections, post-COVID infections, there's even more of this. And Ross has been experiencing a lot of this in his clinic. So he's put together this lecture because a lot of people don't have an option to get this to have a recovery. And this is where Chinese medicine may have a great opportunity to support your community. And so I'm really looking forward to Ross's lecture today. I do want to let you know that Ross is the author of Heart Shock. He also has a course by the same title on our website. He has studied extensively with Jeffrey Yuen and Leon Hammer. And I would say he's a pulse master these days. And really, what I'm really looking forward to myself for this course is the theoretical breakdown he's going to give us. You know, we always like the herbal prescription, the acupuncture prescriptions. Who doesn't? However, that whole expression, give me a fish I eat for a day, teach me to fish I eat for a lifetime. He's really going to give us some great diagnostic approaches to this condition. And I saw in the notes that he does sprinkle in some of the treatment approaches as well. But I think it's the theory and your ability to diagnose it, which is going to be key, the theory of this part. I want to just bring up our disclaimer briefly as well. And I want to let you know that this lecture is for educational purposes only. This is not intended to be medical advice. So therefore, it should not be perceived or received as medical advice. If you have a health condition, please seek out a healthcare provider. Again, this is for educational purposes only. Ross, if you could bring up your PowerPoint, let's get that ready. For those in the live webinar, I want to remind you to post your questions in the chat, and we'll moderate your questions during the Q&A as well. And I'm going to hand over the microphone to Ross, and I'm looking forward to learning along with you, my friends and colleagues.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just move that around. Okay, cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I appreciate the attendance on a Saturday. And I will also just mimic what Lauren said and apologize for those who thought this was a pot talk. So hopefully we'll still get something out of this today. So, so for us today, the topic, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and it's a topic that, you know, it's kind of near and dear to my heart because I've been seeing POTS patients for, you know, probably close to 2 decades now. And of course, there's been just an explosion of these cases since COVID and as a post-COVID response. And so I wanted to spend some time detailing some of my thought processes on this, and then of course, you know, tie it into the mechanisms itself. So the purpose today, like I said, will be to use the understanding of Chinese medicine, some of its Taoist roots and pulse diagnosis, to understand the ubiquitous increasing prevalence of POTS in the recent year. Okay, and so we'll detail the underlying mechanisms of POTS, but I want you to understand that this will also be relevant to things like chronic fatigue syndrome and some of these other kind of long haul symptoms that we see. So our objectives for today is really, we're going to spend a little time on some of the biomedical aspects of POTS. Not a lot, because this is not a class on Western medicine, but I want to just give some tie-ins. And first, we're going to really spend some time on the Chinese medical side. And then I want to convey some of the really characteristic and, if not pathognomonic, findings of POTS on the pulse itself. Okay, and then we'll discuss some acupuncture and herbal strategies, perhaps, and some lifestyle modifications, and even go into, if we have time, a case study or two that I have. So I want to start with the liver and the gallbladder, because this, for me, is really the crux of understanding POTS. Now, when I want to be clear that when we're talking about POTS, there is a certain similarity to heart shock in the sense that this really is a systemic process. I don't really see this as just kind of one diagnosis. It's really sort of an umbrella term, and there's multiple dynamics at play. But I want to start with the liver and the gallbladder, because for me, this really is the epicenter of the problem. And so, as one of my mentors, Dr. Hammer, has stated and written, the ability to create liver qi stagnation is an ecological adaptive response, right? So often what we're seeing in TCM is using liver qi stagnation as this sort of kind of disease process. And in reality, and while it does create symptoms and smoothing the flow of liver qi can be helpful in remedying lots of different complaints, we do have to understand what liver qi stagnation is in its broadest context as an ecology, right? So in order to create liver qi stagnation, we need to have a certain degree of integrity in the liver system. The liver has to be strong enough to suppress particular dynamics internally, right? And of course, there's a pathological side to that in terms of if it's done too long or if it can't be undone. But the capacity to do it is a virtue that we need to be aware of, okay? And so we know that it can create a whole sequela of signs and symptoms for patients. But the more serious consequence is when the liver is unable to contain pathology. Because over time, this creates a fundamental weakness and an instability with very often devastating consequences, one of which we'll see today with POTS and chronic fatigue and some of these autoimmune disorders and so forth, and even cancers, right? Like breast cancers, lymphomas, and so forth, right? Because liver qi deficiency instead of liver qi stagnation really is kind of a marker of the times that we are living in, right? And because of this, we're seeing a rapid and exponential increase in POTS in this kind of COVID-19 era, right? And it's revealing itself from an acute situation, but also we see it chronically as well, right? So what is it about the liver and the gallbladder that is creating or being responsible for some of this impact? And so I want to just go over some very basic functions, right? This is like OM 101 review, but I think it's important just to keep this in the front of our minds, right? So we know it creates the free flow of liver qi throughout the entire body, and not just liver qi, right? So the liver will assist all the directional aspects of all the organ systems, right? So it helps the spleen ascend and the stomach descend and so forth, right? It regulates mental functions and the emotions. It impacts the balance and functions of the internal organs, impacts the endocrine system, right? And especially in terms of its relationship to the pancreas, right? The thyroid, parathyroid, pituitary, adrenals, ovaries, and so forth. It stores the blood. This is a primary aspect of how we're going to see it interplay with POTS, especially with its housing of the Hun, right? It deals with regulating sleep and detoxification, right? Again, these are also, and we're going to see I have some slides specifically on tying this into some of the 6 conformations. So it regulates Wei Qi, right, to the muscles and blood circulation, sinews, ligaments, and tendons, right? It opens to the eyes. We know it's part of the Jue Yin network, and it manifests in the nails as the outward expression. Now, the gallbladder is equally important in the POTS formation. And so it regulates qi on the sides of the body and assists the liver in that function. It influences the bones and the joints, right, from the classical perspective, right? Influences decision-making, the functions of the gallbladder organ, regulates the Shaoyang, which again, we'll tie this in when we get to the 6th conformation area, and it's a curious organ. And I want to make sure you keep that in the back of your mind too, because this is really an integral part of its dynamic in COVID. So in terms of the gallbladder and liver continuum approach, this is part of the primary channels model, and I would imagine that many people have not seen this before. It is kind of detailed a little bit in my textbook, but the idea here is that as we're moving and as we're confronting the primary channels with whatever pathology that there's a particular movement as it internalizes through the systems from the lungs all the way through the liver. And just as a very quick rundown on this, we don't have time to get into this, but it's a quick rundown is you can imagine the lung being confronted with wind cold. If it doesn't manage that wind cold, then it goes into its next channel, the large intestine, and transforms into wind heat. From there, if it's not dealt with, it goes into the stomach, right? The paired yang ming, and here we see the internalization of heat. From there, it pairs up with the spleen, and we start to see dampness as a response and as a compensatory mechanism to the heat, right? If that's not resolved, that heat will move into the heart, which means it's going into the chest and the blood level. From there, it hits the small intestine, and we start to see the beginning of latency take place, where it uses the thick fluids, the yin and the blood, to put things into latency. And over time, things start to diminish the fluids. And we know some of the standard symptoms, what we see with small intestine pathology is dryness, with flare-ups, the inability to sweat, right? As it moves into the bladder, we start to see the pathogen go into the Jing level, and we get latent heat. And then it moves to the kidneys where the latent heat starts to consume and burn off the Jing, right? We start to see like the 5-center heat. From there, it goes into the pericardium where the heat starts to smolder and burns up the structure and the interior. We start to see things like panic and anxiety attacks, right? As it tries to attempt to move the pathogen back out and up through the chest. And then we get into the triple burner. We start to see different types of degeneration and stagnation in the middle jiao and the loss of communication between the heart and kidneys. And then we go into the gallbladder, right? And the gallbladder then becomes this kind of a healing crisis, the last ditch effort to clear the pathogen, right? So we're trying to pull these latent pathogens out of the constitution and discharge them, right? And this is coming again from the constitution layer at this point. And so we start to see an impact on the brain because the channel pathway is there. It's also a curious bowel, which impacts the brain as well. And so this can show up with psychological disorders. We see it with wind and different types of circulation disorders of the brain, right? Strokes. That's a very common post-COVID phenomenon, right? And the blood vessels and heart attacks and so forth. Again, these are all areas of the curious organs. The gallbladder is the mediator of the curious bowels, right? And then by the time it moves into the liver, what we start to see now is liver wind and auto-intoxication, right? We start to see organ system breakdown now, right? So the liver's domain is the reproductive organs. We may see challenges there, right? We're starting to see, for example, some of what we're seeing after post-COVID is damage to reproductive organs, the endothelial tissue, right? Endometriosis and that sort of thing, all right? So I want you to just kind of keep that in mind because by the time we hit these channels, these are some of the problems that we are confronting ourselves with and the patients that we're seeing are confronting. We know from a 5-phase perspective, we're looking at wood, spring, birth, growth, the blooming of new life and creativity, right? And the free flow of expression. You know, of course, we know that this is unique to the individual. That's why the free flow, there's no such thing as the free flow of chi that is the same for every individual. It's a unique phenomenon, right? The liver's the planner, gallbladder is the decision maker that always needs to precede whatever plans are made, right? So the liver is always impacted by stress, right? Irritation, right? It's diverting attention away from our particular purpose, right? We have goals that that the heart is trying to achieve, all right? The heart is on a mission, right? Has a particular curriculum, and the liver helps us get there, right? So if the liver is being impacted, we're seeing a diversion of attention away from purpose, right? Stagnation develops as a result of that, and then we start to see heat. Right? Heat is always the byproduct of the stagnation when the metabolic energy of trying to move energy is confronted by an immovable force, right? And so we need some type of outlet, right? Where's that going to be? The skin, the bowels, right? Urination, right? Rebellious chi and vomiting, right? Or does it get stuck somewhere? And when we're looking at the inflammatory process, oftentimes what we see is that the inflammation creates heat in the blood itself. That's one of the major places that long-term heat from the liver manifests. We start to see what we call in the Shenhammer lineage nervous system tension, right? Creating blood heat, right? And that blood heat over time has a few different features. One is our blood is primarily a fluid source. And so heat and fluid don't mix very well. We start to see dryness, right? As the blood starts to get a little drier, we start to see a thickening and an increased viscosity to the blood itself, right? But at the same time, the vessel walls require the moisture of the blood, right, to keep it supple and elastic. And so without sufficient fluids and blood adhering to the vessel wall, what we start to see is a drying and hardening of the vessels, and what we call on the Shen hammer pulse will be a ropey pulse, right? And a ropey pulse is one that basically is marking the varying stages of arterial sclerosis and hardening of the arteries, okay? And when we're looking at ropey pulses and this thickening of the blood that we talk about is called blood thick, which is a quality that we can feel on the pulse, we also start to look at influence on the hormones and yin essence, right? Because hormones are part of the yi, right? The thick fluids that we were talking about before that the heart and small intestine are managing, right? And so as we're drying this off from the vessels themselves, we start to see different types of diminishments, right? Which could lead to increased heat, things like floating yang and so forth, right? And of course, we can see things like blood stasis taking place. Now, I want to just, of course, bring your attention to one of the main impacts of COVID, which is on endothelial tissue, right? And the blood circulatory dynamic itself, right? And so with this kind of damp heat and blood stasis, we could also look to see, when we're going to talk a little more about this, but some of these medications and herbal medications and supplements that have been so effective, right? Like the things like berberine, which we see in heavy amounts in things like huanglian, huangqin, huangbai, ganjiang, and so forth. And we're going to return to that in a little bit. So in terms of the dragon rises, red bird flies, the psychological